All right, so having to re-record this video because some students said it didn't work the first time. So let's try again. So in the last video, I talked about malaria being a disease caused by protists and transmitted by mosquitoes. And of course, we have to decide what we need to do as humans to treat that. Should we remove all mosquitoes to cure the disease? Of course, that will wreak some ecological havoc on the world as well. So we have to consider what the best approach is in terms of controlling these diseases. Another example of a disease caused by a protist. So once again, by protist, I mean a eukaryotic organism. That's in this case a single cell. And this is an organism known as a trypanosome, and it enters the nervous system, causing individuals who get it to become comatose. So they go into a coma, and eventually they die. And there's over 10,000 new cases a year. And you can see where those cases are generally located there. This disease also causes, I should say, a disease in livestock where cattle and other livestock become ill and die as well. So it's called sleeping sickness in humans and nagana in livestock. But in either case, it's caused by the same kind of organism. These you can see the red blood cells here, and you can see these trypanosoma. Trypanosoma. Go ahead and write that down. Trypanosomes are these single-celled eukaryotic protists that are transmitted by the bite of a fly, and they get into the bloodstream. And they actually have cell membranes that are undulating. You can see there how the membranes are like curvy looking, right? They almost crawl around within your bloodstream. And these are spread by the tsetse fly. That's the vector. Vector means the organism that spreads the disease. So lots of livestock, 3 million cattle are killed a year by this disease. So it's infecting lots of people, tons of cattle, and of course this is part of the world where you can't really afford to have your food source dying off. So this is a big issue. And of course we can spray lots of poison insecticides. And in fact, back in the day when DDT was available, they spread 100 to 200 tons of it a year there. But of course that has impacts on other organisms in the ecosystem. So what do? Well, a new method that has been developed is something known as an artificial cow. So they take a sheet like you see here, and they put a lot of times urine on it from cattle or some other chemical that attracts the fly. And they also spray it with insecticide, and they put like 60,000 of these things around in Zimbabwe, for example, to see what would happen. And they've actually had quite a reduction in cases of both the cattle disease and the human disease because of this attempt. So the flies land on these sheets thinking they're cows, they get insecticide on them, they die. But unlike spraying insecticide, this insecticide stays on the fake cow, so it's not spread all over the environment. Now, one thing that makes these trypanosomes such a difficult organism to catch and cure is that they have a huge part of their genome that's dedicated to changing the proteins in their cell surfaces. So we all know that cells have proteins in their membranes that allow cells to communicate with each other, that allow cells to recognize one another. Well, your body's immune system works by recognizing invading cells because of their proteins, and then destroying them, starting an immune response. Well, in the case of trypanosomes, they switch their surface proteins all the time, and that allows them to basically become invisible to an immune system. So every new generation, there's millions of different copies of proteins in their cell surfaces, so it's really hard for your immune system to lock onto it and get rid of it. And this prevents immunity from developing. Okay? So there are other protist diseases, but those are just two I wanted to mention: malaria and sleeping sickness. Excuse me. Another thing I want to mention is an important invention. So far, all the protists we've talked about have been single-celled protists, but there are some multicellular protists. We know that bacteria, for example, which are not protists, let me be clear, those are prokaryotes, can form filaments. They're not really multicellular, but they link together to form colonies, essentially. But only in eukaryotes do we see macroscopic bodies, meaning bodies that can be seen without a microscope, that have tissues with different functions. So multicellularity, we can tell, has evolved a bunch of times. First of all, we've seen it and those of you who are lucky enough to have a lab saw it in pond water, simple multicellularity. This is when you have like strands of algae, which is basically a bunch of undifferentiated cells, meaning cells that are identical to the cell next to them, but they're all stuck together and they're all part of the same organism. In this case, there's very little cell-to-cell communication. All cells in that organism have the full range of function, meaning they can all photosynthesize in this case. They can all reproduce. They can all do everything that it takes to be alive. In fact, if you cut one of these cells out and set it free, it'll probably grow into another strand of algae. And in most of these simple multicellular organisms, each and every one of the cells of that organism is in direct contact with the environment. Now, complex multicellularity has evolved more than once as well. It evolved in plants, it evolved in animals, it evolved in fungi, and it evolved in some of the protists. So, it probably evolved in protists and then was transmitted onto plants as plants evolved from algae. So, complex multicellularity is when you have cells that are well adhered to one another. There are structures between the cells to allow cells to communicate so they can coordinate. And we have tissue differentiation. So in complex multicellularity, you have cells that have different jobs. So they develop into tissues, and those tissues might develop into organs. So you have cells that are specialized and tissues that are specialized in their tasks. So every cell is not identical like in a simple multicellular organism. And a lot of times in these organisms, not all cells are in direct contact with the environment. And therefore, we start to evolve more complex organ systems. Disregard the chapter 40 reference. I don't have your current book in front of me, but all the chapters on various organ systems arise because of complex multicellularity. So if we look at this cladogram, we can see lots of different eukaryotes. You can see animals, green algae, which includes in this case the plants that arose from green algae, and so on and so forth. Now, in all of the ones that are red here, the red indicates the separate evolution of multicellularity. Okay, so we can see it happened in animals. Animals evolved multicellularity. Fungi evolved it twice in two different groups. Green algae and red algae both evolved multicellularity. In fact, green algae passed it on to land plants, and then the brown algae also developed multicellularity independently from different single-celled ancestors. So that's pretty neat when you realize that. So, in summary, protists are an extremely diverse group. We saw that before. They are not really a true clade unless you include all eukaryotes, right? Ecologically, they influence many levels of the food chain. They are primary producers. They photosynthesize. They make a lot of the oxygen we breathe. They are involved in the cycling of nutrients. For example, there is a group I didn't really mention, but there's a group that lives inside of the guts of a termite that help them to break down food, to help them recycle raw materials on the planet. So they're involved all over the place in terms of ecological flow of materials. So photosynthesizers, decomposers, heterotrophs. Some of them are parasitic and cause disease and can shape the way that countries develop. Some countries suffer lots of loss economically and also to the health of their people because of diseases caused by protists. In fact, even in the United States, there was a huge malaria problem for a lot of our history. And these organisms were the first to evolve multicellularity. We have simple multicellularity, which we see in some of the green algae. We have complex multicellularity, which we see in some of the organisms like animals and fungi and plants, and some of the other algae, where there's multiple organs and organ systems and complex tissues and things. So just bear in mind what a protist is. Don't confuse protist for prokaryote. Go ahead and write out the difference to yourself in your notes to ensure you can tell the difference, and you'll be on track to doing well.